Support for Trifles comes from listeners like you, who support us through Patreon and Substack. Bonus material, thank you gifts, and more await at patreon.com/trifles and at trifles.substack.com. And now you can enjoy some Trifles swag, mugs, notepads, and oval stickers, available in our store. Find it at ihearofsherlock.com/merchandise.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the band was speckled and there were 6 Napoleons, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about why Dr. Watson was called James by his wife? Or of Sherlock Holmes's dining habits? Or what happened when he let a criminal escape?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Bert Wilde will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 477, Dr. Watson and Mr. Wilde. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast, where we get into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wilde.
And Bert, are you prepared to go wilding with me?
I am prepared to go on the wild side.
A walk on the wild side, which is a nice change. Usually you go for a walk on the mild side.
No, I've given all that up. Give me the Tabasco anytime.
You're medium at best.
Yeah. Or partly cloudy.
Spicy Wilder. Well, we do have another episode in our series that we call Mr. Sherlock Holmes the Theorist. It's done the third week of every month. As you know, our show comes out here weekly. And on the third week of every month, we look at a piece of Sherlockian scholarship, something that we think that you ought to know about. Perhaps it is obscure, perhaps it is buried somewhere, but we like to resurrect it and bring it up as a point of discussion, because usually it is about some trifling item in the Sherlock Holmes stories. And in this episode, we're turning once again to Baker Street Byways, a book from James Edward Holroyd in 1959. That's the first British edition. And I think we were with Holroyd last month on looking at Oxford or Cambridge. No, I'm sorry. We're with Gavin Brand,
yes.
whose book My Dear Holmes came out about the same time from the same publisher. So now we turn to James Edward Holroyd with Dr. Watson and Mr. Wilde. What's that all about, you say? Well, stay tuned because we've got a great discussion ahead. We want to remind you that you can support the show in a couple of ways. You can go to Patreon or you can go to Substack. That's patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com. What that gets you is access to bonus content, ad-free shows, and the ability, at least here on Trifles, to participate in a monthly drawing where we give you a free back issue of the Baker Street Journal if we draw your name at random. But those names are only taken from our paying supporters. So check those out and see if that works for you. Should also note that we have a merch store. You can find that at ihearofsherlock.com/merchandise. We have mugs and we have notepads available with the Trifles logo on them. So if you would like to sip from a Trifles mug while you're listening to the show, please, by all means, go check that out and grab yourself a mug. And then finally, we should also note that if you're not yet listening to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, that's our interview show. You can check that out at ihearofsherlock.com while you're over there getting your merch. And just for our iHose listeners, this week, we just dropped a special conversation with Nicholas Meyer about the actor Robert Duvall on how Duvall got the part of Dr. Watson in The 7% Solution. It's a fascinating tale, one told by Nick, who was there as he was working on the script and working with the director Herb Ross. It is funny, it is informing, and it is something that every Sherlockian ought to have access to. So check that out on ihearofsherlock.com. Okay, Bert, we are delving into Baker Street Byways, specifically the chapter called Dr. Watson and Mr. Wilde. Why would Dr. Watson even be concerned with Mr. Wilde?
Well, that's a very good question. Why would Dr. Watson be concerned with Mr. Wilde? Well, it's another one of these cases that crops up occasionally in the world of Sherlockian scholarship. One of the people that we've talked about in the recent past over on IHOS was James Montgomery. And Montgomery was an opera singer and a great fixture in the Baker Street Irregulars in the 1940s through the 1950s. And one of he was a big fan too of Gilbert and Sullivan. And Montgomery wondered why no Gilbert and Sullivan operetta mentions Sherlock Holmes or Dr. Watson. And he wrote extensively about that because here they were, these great men colliding at the same time in history. And it's something similar here with Dr. Watson and Oscar Wilde and Sherlock Holmes because, particularly when you look at it chronologically, there are many points of alignment between Oscar Wilde and Sherlock Holmes, not least of which, of course, is the famous dinner at the Langham Hotel with Lippincotts that Conan Doyle had, at which he met and spent some time with Oscar Wilde.
Perfect. Well, then we ought to jump right in with the warning that Holroyd gives us. So the standing warning against mixing Sherlockian fact and fiction was the late Dorothy Sayers' hazard that the master was a Cambridge man because he found that she had found that a T.S. Holmes was at Sidney Sussex in Cambridge in the appropriate years. And that was shot down dryly but decisively by Sir Sidney Roberts, S.C. Roberts, who pointed out, almost as an aside, that this Holmes, in fact, became the Chancellor of Wells Cathedral. Well, Miss Sayers might have nevertheless returned fire, but for one of Sidney's own speculations that Dr. Watson's full names were John Henry, having been named after Newman by a pious mother. Dare one suggest that Sir Sidney was confusing his cardinals and should have stuck to Tosca? For my part, I take Dr. John Byram's line. But which pretender is and which is king, God bless us all, that's quite another thing. So he says, just as I believe that the Sherlockian umbrella is big enough to accommodate those aficionados who believe that Dr. Watson wrote the stories, as well as those who give credit to his friend, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.
Now, just an aside there, there's a lot going on in that little quotation here. Holroyd says, as you just ably read, for my part, I take Dr. John Byram's line. Well, Byram was a poet, an English poet, and the pretender here is a connection with Holroyd, because Holroyd's name, of course, is James Edward Holroyd. And James Edward was the old pretender in the 17th century. Also, named James Edward. He was known as the Old Pretender. He was the son of the deposed Roman Catholic monarch James II of England and claimant to the English and Scottish thrones. And so somewhere along the line, Byram, the poet, wrote that particular poem, God bless the king, I mean our faith's defender. God bless, no harm in blessing the pretender. But who pretender is and who is king, God bless us all, that's quite another thing. So that's a little, a personal tag there to the name James Edward. And, we go on, and Holroyd is taking us, well into this, and talks about the coincidence that the centenaries of Sherlock Holmes and Oscar Wilde occurred within a few months of each other in 1954. Now, this book, Baker Street Byways, in which we have this essay, was published, I think, in 1959. And so this was the era around which we had the great exhibition of Sherlock Holmes in London, that led to so many interesting things, recurring, a jumpstart of interest, a renewed interest in Sherlock Holmes, that these two eminent figures of the later Victorian era should have been saluted in the same year was less singular than might at first have been supposed, for there were numerous parallels in their career. Now, of course, the birth year of both has been disputed, and the majority favors 1954 for Holmes's centenary. But other people suggest other dates. And despite the consensus of Wilde's biographers for 1954 and the official celebrations in that year, some writers and reference books have repeatedly given 1856 as the year of Oscar Wilde's birth. And there are many other parallels, says Holroyd. Both could claim artistic descent. Holmes from Vernet, the French painter, Wilde through his remarkable poet mother, Speranza. Both had a highly developed sense of the dramatic. Both could assume aliases. Holmes as Captain Basil, Wilde as Sebastian Melmoth. And both, in their heyday, were courted by the rich and famous. Both had royal links. Wilde, as we now know, being the godson of the King of Sweden. Holmes as the confidant of the heads of several reigning houses.
And Holroyd continues. He said, well, maybe it's better to analyze these correspondences in some kind of sequence. So going back to the best known of the contacts, and you mentioned this earlier, Bert, the London dinner that Lippincott held, that he invited Wilde and Conan Doyle, each to write a novel for the monthly magazine. And from that meeting emerged the Sign of Four and the Picture of Dorian Gray. Both were published in Lippincott's magazine during 1890, and some critics have fancied that they could detect unusual Wildean echoes in the Sherlock Holmes story. But in a later adventure, Holmes brutally orders Watson to cut out the poetry. He himself claimed to have become somewhat lyrical in describing dawn over London in the Sign of Four. How sweet the morning air is. See how that one little cloud floats like a pink feather from some gigantic flamingo. Now the red rim of the sun pushes itself over the London cloud bank. Well, this is not really Holmes's line. You got to admit that Wilde did the thing much better when, as Lord Arthur Savile, he saw Covent Garden wagons in the dawn, as the great piles of vegetables looked like masses of jade against the morning sky, like masses of green jade against the pink petals of some marvelous rose. So there we have a comparative set of poetry from Holmes's tongue, or perhaps from Watson's pen, and Wilde's pen at the same time.
And if there's no evidence that Wilde and Holmes ever actually saw each other, there is at least some probability. Indeed, if it be accepted, now you mentioned earlier that we had been talking about Oxford versus Cambridge in a prior episode with Gavin Brenn. But here, Holroyd says, indeed, if it be accepted that Holmes went to Oxford rather than Cambridge, and Sir Sidney Roberts, Gavin Brenn, and Monsignor Knox are among the Sherlockian scholars who have claimed this for him, they would have been contemporary. And Wilde, who had a connoisseur's instinct for ancient lineage, could not have failed to be impressed by so aristocratic a personage as Reggie Musgrave, who reminded even the undemonstrative Holmes of grey archways and mullioned windows and all the venerable wreckage of a feudal keep. Nor would it have been remarkable if, when Holmes and Watson encountered the black-bearded passenger in the hansom during their morning stroll down Regent Street. They had seen Wilde in a neighboring cab, en route for lunch at the Café Royal, which was one of his favorite restaurants. Holmes and Wilde were both prodigious hansom takers. On the summer evening when Holmes and Watson sauntered along Pall Mall to meet Mycroft at the Diogenes, they might also have run into Wilde, who belonged to a club in Albemarle Street and had rooms in St. James's. Wilde, incidentally, took his degree at Oxford in the same year that Dr. Watson took his at London University. And when Wilde first came up to London, he occupied rooms in a dingy street off the Strand, and so may have been a near neighbor of Watson, who was leading a comfortless, meaningless existence at a private hotel in the Strand.
And about that time, in early 1881, Holmes and Watson entered their immortal partnership at 221B. And on March 4th, they set out for Lauriston Gardens, Brixton, on the investigation of a murder. It's not clear whether Watson's literary ambitions had emerged at that period. Holmes, however, was already an occasional contributor to the magazines, for it was his article, The Book of Life, which Watson characterized as ineffable twaddle. Wilde, by then, had entered the literary field. For 2 days before Watson's outburst, one of his poems had been published in The World, the gossipy periodical in which Wilde and Whistler were later to indulge some not very dignified slanging. In Mycroft's exhortation to his brother in the Bruce Partington plans, never mind your usual petty puzzles of the police court, one also detects an echo of Whistler's waspish and ill-deserved sneer. Oscar picks from our platters the plums for the pudding he peddles in the provinces. It was also in the year of 1881, speaking of peas, that Patience opened in a long run at the Opera Comique, and that Punch began its frequent and often exceedingly crude attacks on Wilde. On September 17th, 1881, a parody of a Wilde poem was described as stanzas by our muchly admired poet, Drawit Mild. Well, there's your walk on the mild side, Bert. In February the following year, about the time when Alexander Holder, the banker, was splashing through the snow to consult Holmes about the barrel coronet, Wilde was driving a masterful snowplow through the prejudices of North American audiences on his now famous tour. Dr. Watson would, of course, have noted that during his progression that Wilde visited one of his own heroes, the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, whose unframed portrait stood on top of the books sitting in 221B.
We may be sure that Holmes and Watson, who read all the papers and kept an extensive index of cuttings, took proper account of Wilde's increasing stature as a serious poet and literary and dramatic critic in the immediately succeeding years. One fancies that with their taste for good living, they would especially have relished his article, Dinners and Diners, which appeared in the Pall Mall Gazette on March 7, 1885. And what an intriguing underlining of our present speculation is opened up by Wilde's anonymous article in the Court and Society Review for May 4th, 1887, entitled, Should Geniuses Meet? Meanwhile, the coincidences continued. On April 13, 1887, Wilde reviewed William Gillette's drama, Held by the Enemy. Who could have guessed that before the century was out, Gillette would have written another play with Sherlock Holmes as hero? Readers A Sign of Four will recall Miss Morstan, later to become Dr. Watson's wife, had a rendezvous under the portico of the Lyceum in Wellington Street, Strand, as the crowds were arriving. On that September day in 1887, it's possible that Wilde himself was at the theater that very evening, for on September 14, 1887, the Court and Society Review published his notice of The Winter's Tale at the Lyceum. In passing, it's pertinent to recall that Aubrey Beardsley, Yellow Book drawing Lady Gold's escort, is set in the portico of this theater. And another of his well-known drawings poses a further inquiry as to whether Holmes or Watson ever met the marvelous boy. We know that Beardsley was an ardent worshipper of Wagner. We know that Holmes and Watson were opera-goers, and that at the end of the Red-Headed League, they went to a Wagner night at Covent Garden. It's pretty certain that Holmes, with his special interest in art, must have noted the phenomenal flowering of this young genius of the 90s.
Also, in 1887, Holmes investigated the affairs of Lord Robertson Simon, and Wilde wrote an account of the crime of Lord Arthur Savile. These two young London noblemen were doubtless acquainted. And the following year, about the same time, the Times was congratulating Wilde on his editing of Woman's World, while Holmes was telling Watson, "The fair sex is your department," in The Second Stain. Parallelism reached its peak of fame, however, in 1893, when both Holmes and Wilde were twice parodied in the same issues of Punch. On August 26th appeared an Adventure of Picklock Holes, together with a discussion of Oscar's newest comedy, under the not very subtle title of Still Wilder Ideas. Then, in the New Year's Eve issue, came another Picklock Hole story and yet another burlesque of Wilde, in which Dorian Gray was seen taking Juliet to dinner in the company of Richard Feverel, Ethel Newcomb, Ernest Maltravers, and Tom Jones. I shall not elaborate on the coincidences that Robert Ross, Wilde's literary executor, once published an article entitled The Landscapes of Mr. Holmes, that Lord Alfred Douglas, like Watson, was a turf addict and had an account at Cox's, or that Wilde's marriage at St. James's, Sussex Gardens, Paddington, was in the same neighborhood as Irene Adler's at St. Monica's, Edgware Road. But I may be permitted to point to numerous parallels among the characters of these two. Otherwise, how different worlds. One could claim, for example, that Lady Windermere had at least a topographical affinity with Langdale Pike, the gossip writer of the illustrious client. Lady Windermere's London home was called Bentinck House, and was doubtless in Bentinck Street, where Holmes had a narrow escape from the whizzing van. Parker, the Windermere's butler, might have been related to the performer on the Jew's harp, who kept watch in the empty house. The Honorable Gwendolen Fairfax, almost a blood relative of Lady Frances Carfax, while Sir Robert Chilton, Bart, Undersecretary of Foreign Affairs, an ideal husband, was obviously a contemporary of the Right Honorable Trelawney Hope, Secretary for European Affairs. When in the Canterville Ghost he read, "He rubbed out the stain a second time," well, we take our illusion without hesitation. While young Washington Otis's letter on the subject of the permanence of sanguineous stains when connected with crime was, of course, precisely the kind of monograph that Holmes himself might have written. Nor do we require any qualities of master detection in order to see the significance of this quotation from the Sphinx. "Foul snake and speckled adder crawl."
But it is to Lord Arthur Savile's crime, published in 1887, the same year as Study in Scarlet, that we must look for the most striking evidence of affinity between the literature of Baker Street and Tite Street. In the opening scene of the story, for example, there is a duchess who uses one of Watson's favorite expressions, "Good heavens!" and a girl with violet eyes like those of Alice Turner in the Boscombe Valley Mystery. The chiromantist's reading of a guest's palm sounds like one of Holmes' own assessments in reverse. An adventurous nature, 4 long voyages in the past and 1 to come, been shipwrecked 3 times. No, only twice, but in danger of a shipwreck on your next journey. A strong conservative, very punctual and with a passion for collecting curiosities, had a severe illness, between the ages of 16 and 18, was left a fortune when about 30. Great aversion to cats and radicals. How illuminating also to have compared the palmist's elaborate treatise on the subject of the human hand with Holmes's own monograph on the influence of a trade upon the form of the hand.
When Lord Arthur went on to his nocturnal prowl, he must have passed Baker Street. He walked along the park, crossed Oxford Street, and presently found himself at Marylebone Church. At times, the story, moreover, adopts the authentic idiom of the Sherlockian saga. Lord Arthur rushes across the room, flings himself into a divan. There are also familiar touches of a hansom and policeman with a bullseye lantern. Later, when the young lord, buying poison at a Mayfair's chemist's, explains that it was for a large Norwegian mastiff, which had already bitten the coachman twice in the leg. Well, we immediately hear overtones of Sigerson and Carlo and Victor Trevor's bull terrier. We can see him appearing into the club library in the Pall Mall with the Pall Mall, the St. James's, the Globe, the Echo. We do not at once recall Holmes's instruction, of course, about the goose advertisement and the blue carbuncle. And when we're told that Lord Arthur visited a Russian who had lodgings in Bloomsbury, we naturally recall that both Holmes and Conan Doyle had rooms in that quarter when they first came up to London. Best of all, in the story, there's a German anarchist, Herr Winkelkopf, who shares Holmes's taste for something a little choice in white wines, and his contempt for the police. I have always found that by relying on their stupidity, we can do exactly what we like. They are also twin souls on the delicate matter of fees. Winkelkopf says, "I do not work for money. I live entirely for my art." Holmes, of course, said, "It's art for art's sake, Watson. I suppose when you've doctored, you've found yourself studying cases without thought of a fee." It's from the Red Circle. One suspects that the explosive barometer which Winkelkopf admitted sending to the military governor of Odessa, and which blew a member of the staff to atoms, might have been the reason why Holmes, in A Scandal in Bohemia, was summoned to Odessa in the case of the Trepoff murder. And there can surely be little doubt that it was another of Herr W.'s pretty inventions, an umbrella that went off as soon as it was opened, which liquidated Mr. James Phillimore, who, as recorded in Thorbridge, stepped back into his own house to get his umbrella and was never more seen in this world. Robert Ross, by the by, lived in Phillimore Gardens, Kensington, and was once apostrophized by Wilde as St. Robert of Phillimore.
In Memories and Adventures, Conan Doyle paid a generous tribute to Wilde's artistry. But when Wilde, exhorting him to see one of his plays, gravely said, "You must go. It is wonderful. It is genius," Sir Arthur heavily recorded that he thought Wilde was mad. It apparently did not occur to him that this was Wilde's customary light-hearted banter. One feels that Holmes himself would have managed the occasion more adequately. Oscar was an incomparable conversationalist, and Sherlock, as we know from The Sign of Four, was no mean performer. Watson says, "I've never known him so brilliant. He spoke on a quick succession of subjects, on miracle plays, on medieval pottery, on Stradivarius violins, on the Buddhism of Ceylon, and on the warships of the future, handling each as though he'd made a special study of it." How memorable such an encounter would have been. The two larger-than-life figures, utterly dissimilar save that both had genius, each a foeman worthy of the other's steel, each a superlative master in his chosen craft, each uniquely representing the opposing poles of the age. But Holmes would doubtless have had the last word, with Wilde as with Watson. Art in the blood is liable to take the strangest forms.
Well, what a marvelous piece of scholarship. And seems to me it takes one to be just as familiar and adept at Wilde as it does with the Sherlockian canon. So bravo to Mr. Holroyd.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is no trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
He prefers to take as few people as possible into his confidence.
I'm sorry, Mr. Wilde. The matter is easily remedied. Mr. Sherlock Holmes can return to London by the morning train.